Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about evolution again, and now we're going to go into some of our evidence for evolution and some different patterns that we see. So before we talk about this, it's important that you understand what a selection pressure is. So it can be anything that basically determines who lives and who dies. It determines which traits are beneficial and which ones are detrimental. So these could be factors in the environment, like the climate, the amount of food that's available, the amount of habitat that's available, the different niches that can be filled, different types of natural disasters that come along and start succession over, anything like that that's going to control who survives and who doesn't. They can also be other organisms. So we've talked already a little bit about coevolution and how organisms impact each other. So predators and prey tend to co-evolve in response to each other. Predators get better at catching the prey gets better at escaping the predator. Same thing with parasites and their hosts. Plants and pollinators tend to evolve together to fit each other better. Any kind of symbiotic relationship, each symbiont is going to affect the evolution of the other symbiont. And then we did mention a little bit sexual selection as well, which is when the females are actually selecting the traits that they want in the males, and that causes certain traits to become more prevalent in that gender. So as long as you understand that the selection pressure is what's basically going to act on the population and determine who lives and who dies, now we can start talking about some patterns that we're going to see and some evidence for evolution. So we obviously want to make sure we have lots of evidence for this process happening, and that comes through a number of different means. First of all, we can see convergent evolution happening. So convergent evolution is when you have species that aren't very related. In fact, they may not have a close common ancestor at all. They're coming from different walks of life, but they're starting to resemble each other because they live in a similar environment. So if they're in a similar environment, they have similar selection pressures acting on them. So for instance, these are all anteaters. They all occupy a similar niche. They're all different types, but they all eat these insects. So they all have these similar adaptations. The whole population has this trait of this long skinny nose because it helps them to catch those insects. So these are called analogous structures, and basically that's a structure that's similar between two different animals even though they did not get it from a common ancestor. It's something that evolved independently. So this is converging. It's like when two things come together, they wind up at the same place kind of randomly. So there's two ways this can happen. Parallel evolution, which is where they wind up with the same traits at the same time. Or it could be what we call an evolutionary relay. So that's when they wind up with the same traits, but it's at separate times. So an evolutionary relay would be something like dolphins and sharks. They both have that big dorsal fin, but they did not evolve it at the same time in history. Whereas something like mammals, placental mammals and marsupials, they both evolved this ability to give birth to live young, but they do it very differently. So the marsupial has a pouch that it lives in instead. So convergent evolution, they're not super closely related, but they wind up developing similar things. So a couple more examples, and make sure you have plenty of examples written down in these notes. Ostriches and emus. They live on totally different continents, but these birds have evolved to be these huge, giant birds that don't really fly at all because that's advantageous for a similar environment in these grassland environments. Same thing with the sidewinder snakes that you see here. They live in totally different deserts, different continents. They move the same way, they act the same way because it's advantageous for their environment. Right? That's the opposite of divergent evolution. And this is also called adaptive radiation. And basically this says that they do come from a common ancestor and they start to get more and more different. So convergent, not really related, but start to become very similar. Divergent, very closely related, and then start to branch off from each other. So there's lots of different examples of this. You could look at any sort of either any sort of tetrapod, I guess is the best word, when they have four legs and they start to become very, very different things. Or Darwin's finches. These are not Darwin's finches. These are another type of birds, but you can see different birds become very specialized for the type of food that they eat, even though they came from a common ancestor. So it's basically specializing to meet the environment, to meet the selection pressures that they're being faced with. Um, so divergent evolution, we can usually tell that this has happened. Some evidence of this is by looking at homologous structures. So these are structures that they have in common because of their common ancestry. So they don't always look similar on the surface. Because they've diverged, they've gotten very different. But if you start to compare their anatomy really deep, what you can start to see is they have certain similarities. So these are leg bones in tetrapods, things with 4 legs. And you can see that they follow the same pattern. Now they look very, very different, but they all have the same bone pattern where they have the same number of bones going up at the same point. You see some striking similarities. And when you really look at the embryos themselves of how these things develop, those similarities get even stronger. So if you think about it, at these really young stages of embryos, you don't want to make big changes to the way evolution has kind of developed things, because then these embryos might not make it. So nature tends to, once it finds a way that works, it wants to stick with the way that works. And unless there's an advantage to changing the way these things develop, then it's going to stay very similar. So the earlier back we look in our development, the more similarities we see between ourselves and other species that probably developed along the same line. So another piece of evidence for this, of course, is fossils. You can compare not only the anatomy of fossils, but you can kind of use the fossils as a timeline for how things developed. Of course, not everything fossilizes, so that's why we need other pieces of evidence as well. Another type of evidence is called vestigial organs. Basically, these are structures that no longer have a purpose. So they used to have a purpose, but they don't anymore. So like the eyes on a blind cavefish, it's living in the dark. There's some evidence that our appendix might be a vestigial organ, or some whales still have pelvic bones. They don't have legs, so that's vestigial. And then we can also see evolution happening in real time, in real life, in our lifetimes. So there's a number of examples of this that are important, and we can actually watch it happening. So one example of this is drug resistance or insecticide resistance. And what we see here is that when we apply an insecticide, it doesn't kill everybody. Somebody is going to have a mutation out there that lets them survive it. And then that resistance gene is going to get passed on to the next generation. Because they survived, they're going to pass on their traits. And this is a problem because eventually that means the whole population of the pest can resist the pesticide. Or it could be an antibiotic, same idea. The whole population of bacteria that's in your body now resists the antibiotic that you were taking because everybody who was susceptible has died. Another example of this is the peppered moth. I'm sure you were introduced to this in biology, but basically when the environment changed, the trees got a lot darker, these moths turned, in general, much darker. Their whole population turned darker to blend in. And then when the pollution was cleaned up after the Industrial Revolution, the moth population went back to light-colored moths because the dark ones stood out again. Another example is artificial selection. We see this happening with the things that we breed all the time, like dogs, different types of fruits and vegetables. We can purposely change the evolution of a species, so this is also evidence for how this works. So there's 2 different patterns that evolution follows, either gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. So gradualism is what it sounds like. It's gradual. It takes place over long periods of time. This is generally how we think of evolution. But we found that sometimes it actually happens in short bursts. Nothing happens for a while, and then you get a burst of things evolving all of a sudden. And that's called punctuated equilibrium. So if you look at the differences here with the gradualism, you see that these things are changing slowly and gradually over time. Whereas with punctuated equilibrium, all of a sudden there's one big jump. And this is usually because something major changed in the environment. So something changed very quickly. So what we're going to see with climate change here, if things start to evolve, If whole populations are able to evolve because they have the mutations in their genes already, you may see certain traits completely disappear and other ones start popping up because it's something that's happening very quickly and the population has to respond very quickly or go extinct. And then there are three major modes by which natural selection acts: stabilizing, directional, and disruptive or diversifying selection. It's known by both. So let's talk about each of these. So stabilizing selection tends to act upon the extremes. So the selection pressure does not like the extremes. It's going to favor the average person or the average individual. So for instance, with the fur color, it's going to favor these middle colors. They're not white, they're not black, they're somewhere in the middle, and for whatever reason this blends in best to the environment, so these guys survive. So whatever the average is will do better. Or say height, for an example. Maybe it's not an advantage to be too little, it's not an advantage to be too small, you want to be just right. It's that whole Goldilocks principle, right? That's stabilizing selection. Directional selection, on the other hand, is going to favor one extreme over the other. So say it's to their advantage to have a large body size. That means that the small body size ones would die off, the large ones would survive. Eventually the whole population becomes larger, and this is what we've seen with the evolution of the horse. It could be something like fur color. Maybe these darker colors are better able to survive. So the whole population shifts this way. It shifts in a certain direction. So it's directional selection. And then our last type is disruptive or diversifying selection, and this favors the extremes. So maybe for whatever reason, in this environment there are two different niches that can be filled. So if you have dark fur, you do well. If you have light fur, you do well. But if you're in between, you don't blend in, so you get eaten. Or maybe there are places for the smaller animals to live and for the larger animals. But again, if you're in between, you don't really fit into either of those niches, so you don't survive. So again, if you are experiencing stabilizing selection, it's the average trait that's going to be passed on. If it is directional selection, one of the extremes is going to be favored over the other. And if it is diversifying selection, then the average is actually a disadvantage and it helps to be at one of the extremes. So we've talked a little bit already about the niche and how a species has a fundamental niche that it could theoretically fill, but its real role in the ecosystem is its realized niche. And a lot of reasons, a lot of times this is because of one of these types of selection, particularly this kind, where it fits into one particular role. It could technically kind of do the other ones too, but it's better for it to stay here. So this leads us into this idea that species can either be generalists or they can be specialists. If they're generalists, these are going to be the things like omnivores, where they can eat lots of things, they can live in lots of different places. Your invasive species tend to be generalists because they want to spread out. They can tolerate lots of different conditions and sunlight, temperature, water supply, things like that. Specialist species have very narrow niches, so they can only tolerate very narrow ranges of conditions, and this means these guys are much more likely to become threatened or extinct. There's a little bit of a relationship here too, where these generalist species tend to be more likely to be those R-selected species, and these specialists are more likely to be K-selected, but that's not a strict relationship, but you do see that happening sometimes. So our classic generalist would be the cockroach. Cockroach can survive everything. They can live pretty much anywhere. They can even withstand radiation. So a lot of people say, after the apocalypse, the cockroach will still be here. So this would be an extreme generalist species. But these ideas of these narrow niches or these very broad niches really gets back to this idea of either competitive exclusion or resource partitioning. If they're going to split up the resources, then they all can take a little piece of those resources and that can be their niche. Or if somebody comes in, like an invasive species that has a very broad niche, what might happen is it winds up outcompeting some of the other species. So hopefully that's helped you tie it all together a little bit. Come in and talk about this next class, and we'll also get into more invasive species to finish up this unit. See you later.